Hello and welcome back. Our lecture will outline issues related to the development of slavery in the English colonies. We will look at two major topics. The first is the establishment of plantations, and the second is the transition to chattel slavery. The English slave colonies were established in the Chesapeake Bay, which had abundant natural resources. The name comes from the native word meaning village at the river. To begin, let's look at the image on the right. This is a powerful woman, and we see that at least one man lost his head over her. At the top of the image, we see the name America. This is a different view of America than that of the Puritans. Yes, America had natural beauty, but it was also dangerous. Yes, it has resources and wealth, but it will not give them up without a struggle. With these ideas in mind, let's move to our first topic, the establishment of plantations. As we noted in an earlier lecture, the Spanish discovered rich resources in the American colonies they claimed. Just a quick note though, the term America refers to both South and North America. The Spanish were the first to make claims. They were followed by the Dutch, French, Portuguese, and English. Other kingdoms such as the Swedes and Russians also appeared, but had limited impact. The English claims were established relatively late, and so they were behind in the competition for resources. Our understanding of English plantations should be understood in this context. The Spanish set the model for exploiting the Americas. They explored and encountered giant kingdoms such as the Aztec and the Maya in what is today Mexico, and the Inca in what is today Peru and Chile. This picture is a rendition of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. The name sounds similar to Teotihuacan, the city with the pyramids of the sun and moon. But the Aztec capital was built 700 years after the collapse of Teotihuacan. The important point is that the Aztec were at the height of their power when the Spanish arrived, and were extremely wealthy in many things, including gold and silver. The conquest of the Aztec was done by making alliances with the enemy of the Aztec, in particular a nation known as Tlaxcala, and the use of European weapons such as horse, steel, armor, muskets, cannon, and attack dogs. More important to the point of today's lecture, the Aztec had a far-flung system of plantations and produced many products. Corn, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, and beans were some basic food products. Chocolate, indigo, and tobacco were some of the high-value products. All of these products were used by the Spanish to enrich and empower themselves. For plantations to work, they needed labor. The areas claimed by the Spanish had vast populations and a long history of intense agriculture. Thus, the Spanish did not need to change the social or economic system. Instead, their challenge was to make the system work for Spain. Their process was to make political deals with governors in the Aztec Empire. They were allowed to govern as long as they accepted the king and queen of Spain as their sovereign, they accepted Catholicism, and they continued to maintain production on plantations, funneling the wealth to the Spanish crown. Still, the Spanish did not just take from the colonies. This map outlines production regions in New Spain. We see that cows, pigs, sheep, as well as wheat, mulberry trees, and other products were imported by the Spanish. Within 100 years, the Spanish had captured and expanded production in the colony. This model of wealth enriched Spain, and other Europeans sought to duplicate it. Let's now turn to the English attempt. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. Prior to Jamestown, the English did have some luck privateering, which essentially is government-sponsored piracy. The English crown made agreements with pirates who plundered Spanish transport ships in the Caribbean. But privateering is hard to control, and it is not a source of long-term wealth. The English also attempted to find large kingdoms like the Aztec and the Inca, which they had no luck with. Cahokia, as noted in an earlier lecture, had collapsed over 100 years earlier. And the areas the English explored were not in the central agricultural regions of America. The people along the North Atlantic region practiced a mixture of hunting, fishing, and farming. Still, there was some farming, good land, and native populations. What the English did not realize was that since the agricultural practices were not as intense as in Mesoamerica, the social system had not become wholly patriarchal. Women had a strong voice in decision-making. A particularly important aspect of these societies is that farming was done by women, while hunting and fishing were male responsibilities. We will return to this point a little bit later. But for the moment, it is important to know that these social practices became a source of conflict. Looking at this map, we see that the Chesapeake in the Virginia colony is far south of Massachusetts. We also see that other European claims lay between the two English claims. And while the Massachusetts colony served as a refuge for religious radicals like the Puritans, Virginia was established as a source of income. In the Chesapeake, the English did not find existing kingdoms like the Aztec that held tremendous wealth. But the colony did offer an opportunity to follow another part of the Spanish model, building wealth on plantations. In order to create this wealth, the English organized joint stock companies, which in some ways are an early version of corporations. Investors pooled their resources in order to sponsor settlements. The most important thing to keep in mind is that investors sought profits. The Chesapeake was not a place for refugees seeking religious freedom. It was a source of wealth for investors and the crown. Let's now turn to how plantations were organized. An earlier slide showed a map of different goods the Spanish produced in New Spain, what is today Mexico. One of the most profitable was tobacco. Tobacco was pleasing to smoke, it was used in sociable environments, and produced a mild lightheadedness. In addition, it was addicting. Combine these factors and we have a commodity whose demand spread faster than production. From the perspective of investors, these factors provided the impetus to take a risk in the Chesapeake. This is a map from the late 1600s. It shows why the region had so much potential. Here we see the Appalachian Mountains with many rivers flowing to the coast and bay. The rivers provided water for irrigation and for human consumption. In addition, they were natural roadways. Recalling what we discussed about the caravel in an earlier lecture, Virginia rivers allowed seaworthy ships to sail deep inland, gather goods, and transport them to Europe. That there were many rivers meant that tobacco production could spread over a wide region. In addition to rivers, the area had a lot of arable land. Much of the land had already been cleared by native people for farming. The soil was rich in nutrients, and the weather in the region had relatively long growing seasons and short winters that were not overly cold. This region also seemed to have an available workforce. But let's recall the point made earlier. Native people in this region had a division of labor where men hunted and fished and women farmed. This highlights the type of tensions that can occur when different cultures meet. In Europe, men were farmers. Beyond that, the information the Spanish provided from their colonies indicated that native men farmed. This was true in Mesoamerica, but not in the Chesapeake. When the English tried to compel native men to farm, communities often disappeared into the woods or fought against the English. Let's now turn to the solution that investors came upon. To acquire labor, the English looked to the poor of their own country. Slavery was not the first form of labor on English plantations. Instead, it was indentured servants. These laborers signed contracts that defined the nature and length of service. The contracts also detailed the freedom dues that were to be paid at the conclusion of service. While indentured servants were not slaves and could not be bought and sold, their contract could, and the laborer had to follow the owner of the contract. The English economy had been going through difficulties, so there was a large population desperate for work. The enclosure movement also created a large body of displaced people. This refers to large landowners fencing off their land. They enclosed their land. Prior to this, social practice was for peasants to graze their animals on open land. With the fencing of land, peasants could not feed their animals, which meant they could not feed themselves. With increasing desperation, many peasants took loans, and when they were unable to pay them back, ended up in debtor's prison. Inmates from these prisons were often sent to the American colonies as indentured servants. Where the poor signed their own contracts, inmates had contracts signed by local magistrates. With indentured servants in large supply, plantations in the Chesapeake developed quickly. Profits rose sharply each year. And early on, an important aspect of the profits was related to high death rates among indentured servants. Where most of the contracts required 4 to 7 years of service, most servants died before the end of their contract. This meant that investors did not need to pay freedom dues. In addition, investors were given 50 acres of land for each head of labor they delivered. This was called the head rights system. With high death rates among servants, investors kept importing servants and continued to gain head rights from the British government. But things were going to change, which pushed investors away from indentured servants and toward slave labor. Chattel means movable property. In the U.S., we often refer to slavery, but the more appropriate term is chattel slavery. Slavery existed in Europe for thousands of years, but as practiced, early slavery overlapped with indentured servitude. A slave was not a piece of property. Instead, they were unfree labor. People became unfree, whether servant or slave, because of a crime that was committed against a ruling authority. For example, people in debtor's prison who were sent to the colonies as indentured servants would fall under this definition. This unfree labor, whether slave or indentured servant, became free at the end of the term of imprisonment. Chattel slavery is very different. In this new form of labor, the slave is simply a piece of property. They are chattel. And as with other forms of property, the owner possesses all rights. A chattel slave was like an ox or a plow. The transition to chattel slavery is closely related to labor unrest on plantations. As noted previously, early on, most indentured servants died before the end of their contracts. But by the mid-1630s, as the plantation system stabilized, servants increasingly lived through their contracts. This meant that investors needed to pay freedom dues. Beyond that, the newly freed servants had a difficult time finding work for wages. As a result, many out-of-work servants became increasingly desperate. They saw that they had no real place in the colonies. Hunger, crime, and rebellion increased as servants gained their freedom. Coincidentally, in the early 1620s, African servants appeared in the Chesapeake. Early on, black servants held a similar position to indentured servants. And the total number of Africans was small because Spain and Holland were funneling them as chattel slaves to the Caribbean and South America. But by the 1630s, with increased labor unrest, the English sought to copy the Spanish and Dutch practices. The Spanish and Dutch used race as the defining line for chattel slavery. English practices began to move closer towards the Spanish and Dutch system. The change was not immediate. Instead, it occurred over a 50-year period. But by the 1680s, chattel slavery was firmly in place. Looking at this transition, we see that in the 1620s, not accepting Christ was a crime that resulted in slavery. But the laws changed. By the 1640s, race became the defining feature of slavery. An African person could be Christian, have committed no crime, but still be a slave. In addition to defining who could be enslaved, laws related to the treatment of slaves changed. In the 1620s, an owner or overseer of a plantation had to show cause for punishing their laborers. By the 1650s, a chattel slave was simply property, and owners did not have to explain their actions. Changes in laws coincided with the charter of the Royal Africa Company. This joint stock company was organized and protected by the English Crown. It was given the responsibility of acquiring and transporting African slaves to the English colonies. Prior to the Royal Africa Company, Spain and Holland dominated the slave trade. This made slaves difficult to get and too expensive to use on English plantations. The Royal Africa Company gave the English direct access and in turn lowering costs to the point where indentured servants were no longer needed. Slavery increased profits, but also reduced civil disorder because the new group of laborers would not go free. Here we have the beginning of a dark aspect of our history. In it we see that wealth of some is dependent on the poverty of others. The freedom of one group is based on the lack of freedom for others. And race, which had not been a factor in English society, was established as an important defining line.